Everyone, welcome to Beyond the Rhetoric. In this episode, I want to talk about something that seems to be increasingly in the public eye. I call it being in a post-truth world. But I want to speak a little bit about epistemology and some ways that we need more of an explicit focus on epistemology, especially right now. Not that this is a new conversation or anything, but the immediate inspiration for this episode comes from something that I saw posted on social media. And it says, in case you don't feel like reading it, "Get this through your head. They aren't fact checkers. They don't hold a monopoly on truth. What they mean by fact checking is the control of information so that the suppression and censorship of truth can be justified for the purpose of controlling your mind. They want to deceive you into thinking they are actually doing what their name says, when they are in fact doing the opposite. This is psychological manipulation and gaslighting in the highest degree." And this is the kind of thing I just can't believe this wasn't written by. Let's say there are groups or governments or whatever that wanted to sow discord in America, and they have social media accounts that push stuff like this out. And then I think that I'm probably just being too naive, and there are indeed a lot of people who feel very vehemently this way right now. But, the fact that it says fact checkers is, I think, is a reference to recently what happened with Facebook and Twitter shutting down Donald Trump's account, yada, yada. But take that specific term out, and this is exactly the kind of thing that somebody might say in, I don't know, let's say Russia, where over the last decade or more, the press has explicitly come under government control, and they are very careful with what their press says. They don't have a free press in any stretch of that definition. And so I think a message like what I'm reading here would be like, that would be very important in a society like that. Like, we need to recognize that just because established sources say something doesn't mean it's true. So I'm sympathetic to that. So what I want to do today is just talk about it. And I'm not, saying that anybody who feels that what was going on with social media companies fact-checking posts and taking posts down because they failed the fact check. I don't necessarily want to say whether that is valid or not valid from my point of view. What I'd rather do, though, is talk about maybe on a larger scale, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean as a society to have some kind of shared epistemic basis for how we justify what we claim to know? So like I said before, this is really not a new conversation. It's just really had a heightened emphasis on it lately. In the discipline of philosophy, epistemology is a major branch of theory there. And this talk of epistemology has been going on for, at least as old, as long as Plato. So to start just by defining terms briefly, in philosophy, there's epistemology and there's ontology. So ontology is kind of the study of being. And the way philosophy has taken that is not necessarily relevant to what I want to talk about, but in terms of ontology, like, it's supposedly the study of what really is, whereas epistemology is the study of what is known, what can be known, what can't be known, how do we know, things like that. And conversations around epistemology, Plato problematized it, and ever since then, it's been an ongoing conversation, of course, in philosophy, but also in any of the sciences, right? I mean, if we're going to claim in the sciences to know something, well, how are you going to justify that? So, Plato had a very famous allegory of the cave, and he basically said, people think they see reality, but reality is in this allegory is what's happening outside the cave, but you're in the cave and you're looking not even out the door of it, the opening of it, you're looking at the wall. and sunlight is shining through, and you're just seeing shadows on the wall, and that's all you really know. And then he kind of went through like, it takes a lot of courage for somebody to actually turn away from the wall and to walk outside, and then blah, blah, blah. And my problem with that part of the allegory is if somebody makes that choice, then they finally know the truth. And this, Matrix, the movie was, hugely popular. And really all that movie is just the allegory of the cave, just, put into kind of a fun, I think a fantastic movie. But, when you watch The Matrix, Neo thought that he knew what the reality was, and then he took the blue pill, or the red, I think it was the blue, whatever color. He took the blue pill, and then he woke up. He's like, oh, now I see the true reality. And my thinking was, how do you know that? I mean, how do you know what you know now is different than what you thought you knew before? Maybe you're still in a computer simulation. And of course, the series of movies kind of took you through that, and you're always maybe feeling gaslighted. Gaslighting is when somebody manipulates you so that you can't be sure of your own sanity, because what you think you see, you question. And Matrix, I thought did a good job of highlighting that. So this whole notion of like, well, how do you know what you know? And it's one thing on an individual level, but it's more important on a societal level, right? Because sometimes what I think I know affects you, and vice versa. So we have to have some kind of basis here. And of course, in philosophy, there's just so many branches, so many different rabbit holes this went down. I know, obviously, very famously was empiricism versus rationalism. So rationalists were saying, or empiricists were saying, the only thing you can know is what's directly observable. Everything else is unknowable. You can theorize about it, you can make stuff up, but you don't know. All you can know is that. And then rationalists came around and saying, how do you even know that? When you look at something, that could be false. I mean, the only thing that you really know are your thoughts. So the only thing that really exists are what you think about stuff. It's not even stuff that you think is out in the real world. And so they have this conversation going back and forth. Again, how is it that something can possibly be known? So just by way of a thought experiment, let's say that you see a red Porsche outside, and you really started thinking seriously about your epistemology, like, how do I know what I know? So what color is the car? And so you look at it and you say, well, that's red. Of course it is. And a lot of times, what if there's somebody standing on the other side of the car and they're like, that's not red, that's purple. And, then that brings up some possibilities. I know that several years ago, there was the very short-term trend where car companies were using a special kind of paint that looked different from different angles. And so what looked red from the front may very well look purple from the back. It reminds me that there's a cartoon floating around for several years where there's a bunch of blind people trying to figure out what an elephant looks like. And so one's holding the trunk, one's holding the leg, one's holding the tail, one's touching the stomach, and they're all describing what it is this elephant must be. And they're like, we must be touching different animals, because there's no way these are the same thing. And so, this idea that, is it possible that just you see purple and I see red because we're standing on different sides of the car, and the car is a certain weird kind of paint? Or, even more confusingly, how do we know that if I look at the car and you look at the car and we both agree that it's red, that what we're seeing is really the same thing, right? Just because we both have been taught what red is, and so we see something, we're like, yep, that's red. But I don't really know what you see. Maybe you have a form of color blindness, and so you know that it's red, but what you actually experience is very different than what I experience, right? How do you know? And so a lot of times with stuff like this, you really do, in the sciences, in various ways, you just have to get multiple people looking at it. And then you compare what it is that you think you see, and you justify, well, this is where I'm looking at it from. I'm looking at it from the front at the 45-degree angle. And then I try to describe red, and what do I mean by red, and blah, blah, blah. So just because we look at something doesn't necessarily mean that what we see is the truth. So that's kind of an accepted thing in let's say, in the hard sciences. There's what used to be called positivism, which means if I see it, I can be positive about it. I mean, that's not how it's defined. Basically, like if I see it, then I know what it is. And then there's post-positivism, which is it's like, yeah, I mean, I believe that there's an external reality out there, and I believe that my senses can clue me into it. But you can't take anything at face value. You have to be very careful about articulating what might be affecting what you see and what that might mean for the bigger truth. Let's say the ontological truth, right? What are the influences on what I think I know that might shape what, my knowledge, if you will. And then just to take the thought experiment further, where is the red on that car? You say, well, it's the car. It's literally, it's the color on the thing. It's like, well, not really. I mean, because the only reason there's any color at all is because it's in the presence of light. In the complete absence of light, there would be no color. Like light doesn't just illuminate it, light creates the color. So what's on that car is a certain, let's say, texture that when light hits it and comes off of it, and then when that hits your eyeball and goes down your optic nerve, then in your brain, you see red. That doesn't mean that the car is red. The car has an effect of creating red here. And so for all practical purposes, yes, it's red, but is the red really there? And these are a lot of the thought experiments that people that work with epistemology play with. And it's not just, playing around with thought experiments. It really is trying to be very careful about, if you're going to say you know something, let's talk about the extents of what's possible to know. So let's be very careful with how we frame that, what you think you know and why you think you know it. And then, of course, I mean, that it's kind of fun and complicated with anything physical, but what do we get to things that aren't physical, like the social sciences? So if somebody says, for instance, what motivates human behavior? Well, what's the truth of that? How can you possibly ever get to the truth of that? And so what social scientists do is they say, well, what we can do is we can create an experiment, and we can motivate this people, motivate using this thing, and take other people and motivate this other way, and we can see what we can measure it, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I'm not saying there's nothing there to learn, and that there's, why do anything because you can never know. No, I think those methods are very useful, but you have to be so careful because, how do you design a method to try to get at something that really can't even be seen and felt and stuff? It just adds a layer of difficulty to it. And then when you see people, when we have conversations around topics that are really important to us, and a lot of times we don't usually get in arguments about something as easy as what's the color of that car. Usually it's very complex things, right? What manner of society should we have? Whatever, blah, blah, blah. These are really complex things. Whether there's a truth to be found there or not is even debatable. But to the extent that we try to say this is what we should do, yeah, this isn't a red car that we can look at and say, there we go. There's a lot of factors, a lot of assumptions that we bring to the table in trying to make those kind of knowledge claims. Well, all this stuff really started coming out in common conversations, especially in 2016 once Trump was elected president. Because immediately most news outlets, when they were reporting on Trump, and every day they had something, and just everything day after day was just negative. I mean, they focused only on the negative, and they spun everything in as negative way as possible. Now, I'm not a fan of Trump and his presidency, but when he was first elected, I always had this attitude of like, well, maybe let's hope this works out pretty well. And I noticed that right off the bat. I'm like, man, I mean, give the guy a chance, and there was no chance being given whatsoever. And Trump's reaction to that, and he had started this narrative before a little bit, but his reaction to that was just to say, yeah, it's fake news. Right? It's ideologically driven. They're just hardcore leftists. They make stuff up, and then like he said in this tweet, when all the media is corrupt, then it just doesn't matter. And I can appreciate that frustration. But it's certainly, I mean, come on, I mean, both sides were playing that game. When Obama was president, now when Biden's president, Fox News, for instance, yeah, they focus on the negative and they ignore things that might be positive. And what I find funny is I think if you were to take like in this case, what the president did, and then take out who the president was at the time, and I think a lot of times people would support it or not based on whose party it was in. Like a lot of times it's not objective. Sometimes it is, certainly. But what became really troublesome for me about this is that it's absolutely essential to have a free press, right? And it's one thing, you know, I'll talk about that a little bit later. I mean, yeah, there's some problems with the press, but to carte blanche say it's fake news. Now it's like, oh, so how do we know what happens in the world? Is it only what you say? Right? I mean, and Trump, in saying that, does he become the sole arbiter of what's truth? So don't listen to anything except that. And that's kind of terrifying. So I think this is one of the dilemmas we have is when media start taking an explicitly ideological approach to reporting the news. And I don't think I'm too naive about this. I don't think you can ever be objective. I don't think it's possible to be objective, but you can try to be objective, right? I think there used to be a law in the U.S. until the 80s where you had to, news outlets, to call yourself news, you had to present multiple sides of issues and stuff like that. But there's always going to be editorial choice, you know, out of the 14 trillion things that happen in a given day, which ones are worthy to be reported. And whoever gets to choose that has a lot of power. And that's before you spin it or anything else, right? So, yeah, of course, news is always going to have some kind of slant. But you know, if it really were free and independent, the various slants, somebody could look at the variety of news sources and make, you know, figure out their own interpretation of things based on that. But this is when it became a real issue in the United States, when it was a complete dismissal of the news media. It's all fake. So it's like, oh, well, so now on a social level, when we talk back and forth and we want to talk about what's going on, let's say in the country or what legislation or what, you know, whatever, where do we get our news from so that we're going to talk about? And if all of a sudden we have no objective place from it, no supposedly independent free press, that causes problems. So what are the dangers of this, of what I'm calling the post-truth situation that we're living in? Well, I mean, first of all, you know, we see it around us in terms of like alternative facts, which to me, again, is just a terrifying term. But a lot in psychology, we've long known about confirmation bias and things like this, right? I mean, we tend to cling to the things that confirm what we think we already know, and we tend to dismiss things that contradict that. But now, you know, there's mechanisms in place that make it easier and easier to exist in our echo chambers, where we're surrounded only by for the most part, things that we agree with and that we want to hear. That what we see in society is this increasing polarization, and it's increasing because people can tend to think, because all the people that I know and like and trust think the way I do, then this is what right thinking is. And anybody who, let's say, is on the other side of the political divide, who thinks that way, is just wrong thinking. Maybe they're dumb, maybe they're evil, maybe whatever. When I see a quote recently, liberalism is a disease. It's not a quote, I mean, you've heard that for years now. But that statement is very indicative of these echo chambers. Like anything, of course, if anybody that's different from what I and everybody around me thinks is just, you know, wrong-headed. It also allows for massive deceit machines, right? I don't want to say who's doing it. I don't know. Companies or countries that have, you know, bots or just hire just a bunch of cheap labor to make posts on various social media just to stir the pot, just to cause problems, right? Or to influence public opinion, or to think that an idea that otherwise would be considered extreme to make it seem like, no, it's not an extreme view. A lot of people believe it. As I said in my last video, I really do think that humans are capable of anything. I think we're capable of accepting as normal almost anything. At least it seems from my reading of history, that's how I see it. And so now we're more susceptible to that. If there's not a rigorous fact checking, if you will, and I mean that very loosely, then if we feel that whatever this social media post is, and it confirms what we want to believe anyway, and it's more and more extreme, now there's people who feel they benefit from increasing polarization or whatever can really influence that. And I think more generally, I mean, if we want to live in a society that in principle is free and democratic, and I know we live in a democratic republic, I don't need lectures on democracy versus republicanism, but we live in principle in a free and democratic country. That only works if we can have discussion, public deliberation. Democracy as a form of government, as a principle, is based on the assumption that people are going to disagree on things, but they can come together and talk about it, and the best argument wins or whatever. I think I couldn't accept that at face value, but at least in principle, those are the kind of things necessary. If we're going to live in a dictatorship, it's really not necessary, right? I mean, we don't have to deliberate things because the truth is handed to us. The way things are going to be is dictated to us. And so it doesn't matter what we think. But in a society where, no, it matters what we think, because we should be talking about this and trying to figure out together the best way to move forward, we need to be able to agree on what's fact and what's not fact, what's a certain interpretation and what would be another way of interpreting something and whatever. But we have to be able to have those conversations. So that's why I think that right now we especially need to start being very explicit about our epistemology. And I think it's always been true. I think if anybody who is a responsible knower, if you will, throughout human history, should be paying attention to that. But now it's becoming like this is going to be an essential capability for people that have any hope of living in a society that strives to be free and democratic. It's just absolutely necessary. We have to start just being more clear about this is why I think I know what I know. And in doing that, I'm real big on the notion that we humans are incapable of understanding the world in all of its full complexity. And that's okay. But we still need to do better at developing understandings of the world that match, at least a little bit, the complexity that's there. So what does that mean? I think it could mean just a ton of things. But let me start with some things that I think are just really, really important and maybe foundational. One, I think whenever there's knowledge that we're trying to gain, there's different ways that people come at it. So you can come at it from what I call method, where you say, well, based on this thing I want to know, this is a method that would give me as good a chance as I can figure out to know the truth, at least as far as that's possible to know, right? So in the sciences, a lot of times that's the scientific method, right? So they'll say, look, you've got to narrow down the variables just, to one thing and manipulate just one single variable so we can see what the difference is, and that tells us something about that variable. It's not foolproof, but it's a system. It's a method. And we can seek to improve the methods, but at least if we base our knowledge on a method like that, then it's justifiable. You can point to the method. That's why, by the way, we have peer review in hard sciences and social sciences, where we say, for one thing, we have people who understand that method and they can read, how did you go about your research? And if you don't comply with the method, then they just reject it. It doesn't get published. They may disagree with your results, but a lot of times the peer review process will let it go if they say, yeah, but I haven't duplicated that research, but at least the way you described it, if you're being honest, yeah, you followed the method. So then it's the second part of this is then other people can read that. They can duplicate your research and see what they find. And so if you lied or whatever, or if you were sloppy in your methods, that should come out eventually. So overall, it's not foolproof. Things can leak through, but overall, the general direction should be good because we pay careful attention to the methods that we use to justify why we think we know what we know. But really, it's impossible to have the time to use a method for everything. I can think of very few things that I think I know that I followed that method to determine the truth for myself. And that's why I think, begin with method. But when the method isn't realistic, then I think it's reasonable to trust the source. So if I want to know about, I don't know, COVID and its effects on the body, and I don't have the resources or the labs and the expertise to figure that stuff out for myself, then you go to a reliable source, a source that is using the method that is appropriate for that situation. That's what just kills me about conspiracy theorists, with people that think that, with all these smart people with a lot of expertise studying something, that they can just think about it for 5 minutes and say, oh, I can't believe they never thought of this, those dummies. It's like, really? I mean, think about that for a minute. Really? And then people say, well, yeah, but science can be wrong. Yeah, accepted truth is often wrong, but there's a difference. Usually, when it's wrong, sometimes there's a huge paradigm shift. But often it's just like, oh, we thought this, but that's not quite as, let's say, complex. Like that doesn't represent the complexity of reality quite enough. And so we tweak it and we tweak it and we tweak it. There's a big difference between the way that science is wrong and the way that the guy at the bar who thought about it for 5 minutes is wrong. And I think, so, begin with method, then go to source. I think that's fair. But you never start with truth with a capital T, and that's where you start. Most people do. And it's frustrating to talk with people. If you say, why is it that you think you know this? Because I know it. Well, I know that you think you know it, and I know what it feels like to think that you know something, but of course you can still be wrong even though you think you know it. Why do you know it? And they can't point to method. They can't point to it's reasonable to trust this authority because those are experts there, blah, blah, blah. Even though they could be wrong, even though likely 1,000 years from now they'll certainly be considered wrong, it's still a lot more right than any other way we have of knowing. But a lot of times we want to say, no, we start with the truth. I already know the truth, and so now I'm only going to listen to things that support this truth because this is what I'm going to believe no matter what. Yeah. Now, sometimes people take the source and they'll say, well, yeah, whatever my religious leader says, that's the source. I'm like, no, that's just, you're starting with the truth. Whatever they say, you're going to count as truth because of that. And unless you're talking about issues related to your religion, then I would say that that's not the source that's justifiable. So we're talking about genetics, a tribal leader in Afghanistan that says, no, this scientific view of whatever, it doesn't work. Like that's not a justifiable source for that knowledge claim. And I think this is where we get caught up with the worst problems. It's be a very human temptation to begin with what you think you already know, and then your whole job is trying to justify and support that, rather than actually trying to figure out is what you think you know correct, and how might you figure that out. So, and I'd say, imagine a world where we don't have these kind of shared epistemic principles, where we can't sit together and say, yeah, the earth is round. I know that there's some flat earth theorists out there, but there's no justifiable reason, either method or source, to believe something like that. Imagine what that would look like if you got charged with a crime and you got called into court. And the court said, well, yeah, we really can't know anything, so is this guy guilty or not? It's just absolutely horrifying. And that's what was really frustrating with the Stop the Steal fiasco in the last election. I don't care which side of the political divide you're on. When somebody comes up, when Trump said before the election ever started, people are trying to corrupt it. And then after the election, he's like, it was corrupted. And all these courts were saying, great, bring us witnesses. And every single court, the witnesses just didn't have any evidence. Nationwide, no evidence. I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. For you to think that despite nobody having any evidence, it's still true because it's what I want to be true, because I live in an echo chamber and I can't believe that my candidate didn't win. That's what I felt when Hillary Clinton lost to Trump. I wasn't really, whatever. I couldn't believe that Trump would win. It just never occurred to me that he could, and he did. And I was just like, wow, this just can't be right. And then I realized, yeah, that's because you live in an echo chamber, and you're not talking very frequently with people that can very well see how Trump could be elected. And I think that this thing that evidence and rationale is absolutely essential if we're going to live together in any way that doesn't drive everybody crazy. And that's why we need things like a free press. And I mean a really free press. I think press where all the news outlets are owned by a very small handful of people is a problem. That's not really a free press. So our press today isn't ideal, but that is an ideal we should go for. A free press that's required to justify how they report things, to have a basis for it, and that truly is free. Certainly free of governmental control. I mean, that's terrifying once the government controls free press. And like I said, in the sciences, that's why we have independent peer review, just so we can have these shared epistemic principles. So there can be dangers here. I mean, right? There can be dangers of clinging too tightly to the truth. And what I mean by that is assuming that you know the truth regardless of anything else. But there's the danger the other way of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, of just throwing out the possibility that any truth really exists. And so now everybody's view is equally good. I think in the movie Irrational Man, it was great. He's like, you got this French post-war bullshit. And that's what I find so ironic too, because, this whole post-truth stuff is, it happens on all sides, but it's, lately it's been a lot of conservatives who have kind of grabbed onto this notion of, are there even such things as facts? What really matters is just ideologically what people are saying. But that's actually kind of a liberal creation, especially with postmodernism and post-structuralism, where they were questioning knowledge and knowledge claims and basically showing how power is inherent throughout all of it. But then some people went way too far and said, therefore there's no truth. Everything is just power fighting it out. And I'm like, well, it wasn't good. It was French War, post World War II French bullshit, and it's not good when anybody does it. For us to function together, we have to assume that there's some reality out there, and we have some access to it, and then we can agree on how we're going to access it so that we can come to some kind of mutual understandings about things. Because this notion that there's no truth leads to totalitarianism. If there's no truth whatsoever, then it's just whoever has the most power determines the truth. And now we're in an Orwellian nightmare. How do you check power if you can't say, hey, wait, that power, whoever's in power, lied about this? Well, how could they lie if there's no truth? Right? So I think that's a cop out, and I think it's a tool for people that are trying to hold on to or gain power. And I think the only way we really have to prevent it, to fight against it, is for all of us who care about living in a free and democratic society to focus a lot more on justifying why we think we know what we know, and being open to the possibility that we live in an echo chamber too, and that people can have vastly different views from us, and there could be validity in the views. That doesn't mean all views are equally good, but we have a basis for that conversation. And next week I'll talk more about pluralism and what that means when I say that there are many, many possible good views, but not an infinite number.